Good morning, everyone. It's a very great privilege indeed to be invited to deliver these patent lectures, and a great delight and privilege to be the guest of Fuller on this occasion. Thank you for your warm welcome, and thank you all for attending this first lecture. I look forward to discussion and exchange later on. I begin with a quotation. "Bearer of no personality, no social identity, no aspirations above those of fulfilling the most basic needs, the modern individual encounters us simply as the bearer of human rights, that tide of undifferentiated demands that relentlessly erodes the coasts of our social institutions." Words from my former colleague and friend Oliver O'Donovan. It's a description of the contemporary Western mind and myth, which crystallizes the challenge of holding together a politics increasingly preoccupied with the language of rights and a theological tradition in which such language is at best deeply problematic. What do you have that you did not receive? St. Paul demands of the Corinthians. Surely the essentially religious stance is one of humble acknowledgement of indebtedness, rather than one which allows us to claim a dignity or status that is independent of both the grace of God and the close woven fabric of human community. Are we to imagine that we have a claim upon our Creator? St. Paul would have a short answer to that kind of question. Now, some Christian thinkers, Nicholas Walterstorff above all in recent years, have made sophisticated attempts to show that the modern language of human rights is in fact rooted in scriptural and Christian categories. But others, notably Alistair MacIntyre and John Milbank, have strongly resisted any such peace proposals and have seen contemporary rights discourse as an aberration from anything that could be recognized as a mainstream religious anthropology in the Abrahamic tradition, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim. And it is certainly not just a Christian issue. From the Islamic point of view, the critique of the supposedly Western-inflected language of human rights has generated a rapidly growing literature. Though, as Anne Elizabeth Meyer pointed out in a detailed and still very useful survey some years ago, there's a curious tension between the desire to challenge Western versions of rights on the one hand, and to claim that the universalism and commitment to civic liberties championed by human rights discourse is already to be found in authoritative Islamic sources. But the sense of a bad fit between rights language and much of the theological tradition is unmistakable. If you grant the fairly obvious point that traditional religious texts just don't directly use the language of human rights in the sense of legitimate claims which any human being may make, if you allow thereby that there's a prima facie problem here, then perhaps it's time to try and clarify further just what sorts of claims we're actually talking about. This is where a degree of confusion comes in. Now, the religious critique I mentioned, Oliver O'Donovan's remark at the beginning, refers to undifferentiated demands made by atomized, isolated individuals. Or, as with John Milbank's discussion, it may refer to the fatal link between the idea of rights and the idea of property. The idea that I, as an individual, own my body, my will, my wants. But I think this is to focus very narrowly on how the language is used, mostly in informal, not to say journalistic contexts. And also, incidentally, it's to ignore a great deal about how human rights law is actually applied in practical jurisprudence. You may scour the work of Oliver O'Donovan or John Milbank to find any reference to how human rights law actually works. Unrelated and unconditional demands and a property-based approach to human rights were by no means what advocates of human rights in the middle of the last century were starting from. in the campaigns which led up to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights 70 years ago this year. Another appropriate anniversary to commemorate. Pamela Sloat, in a recent article, has pointed out the role, particularly of liberal Protestant thinkers in the United States during the 30s and 40s, in developing the discourse of rights as a way of translating specific concerns about social and often racial justice into a language of universal norms. Similarly, the foremost Catholic political philosopher of that era, Jacques Maritain, was actively involved in the drafting of the Universal Declaration, arguing for universal and inalienable rights as a corollary of his commitment to Christian personalism, the liberty of each agent to develop their humanity freely but in communal respect, so as to realize their God-given dignity. None of the arguments emerging from either Protestant or Catholic sources in this period appeals to an ownership model of personal identity as a rationale for universal rights. None is concerned with undifferentiated demands. The assumption that underlies the advocacy of those Christian writers of the mid-20th century is that the dignity of the human person is under threat from a variety of modern political philosophies, both totalitarian and professedly liberal, and that the affirmation of inalienable rights is above all a statement of the limits of political authority. In other words, the roots of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are not so much in the assertion of individual claim as in the attempt to secure basic political liberties against what aims to be an all-powerful state. In the wake of the Second World War and the increased dominance of the Soviet state in Eastern Europe, such concerns were obviously acute in 1948. And any contemporary skepticism about human rights discourse needs to reckon with this historical fact, this particular context. But a difficulty arises. It's been worked out in, for example, Roger Ruston's very interesting discussion of the philosophy of John Locke. The difficulty arises when you merge this broadly negative role for human rights, limiting the claim of the state, with two other themes. What begins as a defense of liberty of conscience becomes a defense of the individual against the community as much as against the state. And John Locke himself, beginning from a fairly traditional account of how property rights are grounded in rational usage by rational persons, takes the argument in new and pretty problematic directions. In Locke's hands, it becomes an apologia for abrogating some people's prima facie property rights on the grounds that some territories are not under proper regular cultivation, or are being neglected by their inhabitants, and thereby their inhabitants lose all right to them. Other people can come in and take them over, which may remind you of certain episodes in history. It adds up, I'm afraid, to a neat justification of colonial appropriation. And John Locke was heavily involved in colonial projects in North America, and he is deliberately providing a rationale for the seizure of Native American territory by this argument. They're not looking after it properly, so they don't have a right to own it. Now, one result of this is that the idea of right comes to be associated not with the liberties or dignities that no actual system of human power can take away from you, but with a set of entitlements belonging primitively to each individual. And among those entitlements is the freedom to exercise and enforce a claim against those who have in some sense forfeited their dignity by failing to use their liberty as they should. We're well on the way to the intrinsically conflict-laden social assumptions of most liberal modernity. John Milbank has argued that talking about inalienable rights in this context, is vacuous and self-subverting. If a right is only inalienable when it's understood as a piece of individual property, then like other bits of property, you can sell it off, you can lose it, you can have it confiscated by a more powerful claimant. And typically, in modern civilization, you sell off your right to the state in return for the state guaranteeing other property-like rights, including, and perhaps above all, the private right to liberty of opinion. So individualized rights become the foundation of an absolutist state. Well, that's a very ingenious argument, and it's got some historical force, especially if you look at Thomas Hobbes as well as John Locke. But I'm going to argue that it's only part of the truth about the genesis of modern language about rights. If you claim that all human beings, irrespective of status, ethnicity, gender, income, or whatever else, have certain fundamental interests simply in virtue of being human, is to say that no political authority can act in such a way as definitively to frustrate those interests without losing its own moral legitimacy. That's to say, what is due to human beings as such is not at the mercy of passing administrative convenience. In this sense, even if a citizen or group of citizens consents to being governed by a totalitarian system, that doesn't render that government just or lawful in any intelligible way. And it doesn't destroy the fundamental interests that rights represent. As John Milback and others have rightly argued, pre-modern discussion of these matters took it for granted that the word justitia, justice, designated a real objective order in the universe. Just action is what is in accord with that order. And justice, justitia, is treated as the highest of the cardinal virtues because it's not simply a state of the individual soul. It's always oriented towards the good of the other. That's what you find in Thomas Aquinas in the second division of the second part of his Summa Theologiae. Question 59, Article 12, as I'm sure you will remember. But that good, in turn, would be unintelligible without reference to the common good of the community and ultimately of humanity as a whole. Justice is primary among the virtues because it's not simply about me. Not only is it not about me, it's not just about you either. It's about the community and the community within the order of the world. So any individual's fundamental interest as a human being would have to be assessed and responded to, not simply on the basis of their own account of their desires, but by the extent to which those desires could be accommodated without damage to the shared well-being of the human community. Now, pre-modern treatment of this assumes, of course, a very particular doctrine of the human good, individual and communal, grounded in Christian theology. But from a purely formal point of view, this is a structure preserved in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states towards its conclusion, in Article 29, Clause 2, that the protection of the entitlements it has spelled out is subject to the requirements of a social and political order whose task is to safeguard every citizen in the same way. It's not a commitment to the merely abstract equality of isolated subjects, bearers of no personality, no social identity, in O'Donovan's words. It's a recognition of interlocking interests, necessarily affecting each other. It falls some way short, and I'll explain this a bit later, of what a Christian might want to say, theologically. But it doesn't operate in quite such an alien world as some recent Christian commentators have implied. It assumes a crucial point that's strongly underlined in the preamble to the Universal Declaration. the point that only some formal recognition of fundamental interests can protect any political order from justified rebellion. In plain language, the state is legitimate only when it guarantees not to infringe or to frustrate a set of basic securities and liberties of association, including, significantly, association in families. So far from the state being simply the provider of required goods for the individual, the state is charged with the protection not only of individuals, but of associations which don't depend on it for their existence. And while the Declaration somewhat obscures the clarity of this point by an over-detailed list of hybrid entitlements, it remains plain that the force of the text is directed against claims like those of the Third Reich in Germany, claims to override prior primary forms of human solidarity, church, family, cooperative working units, and so on. And I find it odd that many contemporary critics of human rights language don't engage in any depth with the words of the Universal Declaration. Its theological ancestry is not too far below the surface, with its implicit endorsement of a naturally plural pattern of association not franchised by sovereign authority, and its implicit warning to states infringing basic liberties that they can't claim immunity from internal or external challenges on the grounds that they're absolutely sovereign. But it is indeed possible to read the Declaration rather differently if you forget that ancestry. And it's the obscuring of this legacy which our critics are most worried about. If you ignore what I call the primarily negative thrust of the Universal Declaration, as read in the light of its preamble, you may conclude that it envisages a situation where the state is required not so much to respect and protect existing solidarities as to respond to the individual's demand for specific goods, with the notion of common good very much as an afterthought. This isn't the overall grammar or ethos of the Declaration, but an increasingly individualist and consumerist society is more likely to interpret it in such a way. And if that is how it comes to be interpreted, there is indeed a consequence for the doctrine of the state that's every bit as disturbing as Milbank and others suggest, though for slightly different reasons. I discussed in an earlier lecture that if we take this line, we're pushed further down the road to the model of the state as a sort of producer over against the individual as a consumer. What the great Philip Bobbitt has so acutely analysed as the market state. It's a model currently so prevalent as to be the default setting of capitalist modernity. Not a naked totalitarianism, but a system in which the individual, a solitary proprietor of their body, desires, interests, and goals, is the unquestionable centre of social imagination. The state's legitimacy in this sort of framework will come from its success in meeting these demands, not from its basic role of securing equal access to protection and redress by law. Some of you, I hope, will know Philip Bobbitt's huge and really important book, The Shield of Achilles, which sets out an argument along these lines with great learning and great eloquence. But what I'm arguing here is that a theological response to this challenge shouldn't stop at a denunciation of the language of rights, as though this immediately clarifies what needs to be said about the relation of the person and the state. There's a vigorous and interesting debate about whether pre-modern Christian thought has any concept analogous to individual rights as we now understand the term. And this is a debate which offers some important insights, though it doesn't quite answer our current questions. So I'll touch very briefly on that current debate. If you're not very interested in medieval political philosophy, now is the time to check your emails. In broad terms, we can say that medieval discussions treat the word jus, law or right, as designating what we could call an objectively appropriate share in material or social goods. An objectively appropriate share in material or social goods. So it can stand equally for the right to perform certain acts, to exercise certain lawful powers, or for the claim to receive what is needed for ordinary human survival. So jus has two faces in the system. It's my freedom to act according to the license that I possess. It's also my proper expectation of things that will sustain my life in community. So St. Thomas Aquinas can say, for example, that it is a matter of natural right, jus naturale, that the superabundance of the rich is owed to the poor for their support. Equally, we can conclude that this medieval discussion, more or less up to the rise of nominalist philosophy in the 14th century, sees the whole issue in the light of a robust doctrine of cosmic harmony and mutual nurture. Each element in the universe has a proper role in the well-being of every other. And jus, law or right, is the word used for this balanced reciprocity. Justitia, as we have seen, is first among the virtues because it is essentially relational. It's essentially to do with the state of the moral human world, not the isolated soul. In this sense, as the formidable Roman Catholic commentator Ernest Fortin rather tartly observes, the right, the jus, of a criminal is to be punished. That's what's owed to the criminal in the universal moral economy. So language about giving everybody their right, their jus, in the Middle Ages is very different from saying that each person is owed what makes for their immediate happiness or their temporal subjective satisfaction. Now, on such a basis, it's obviously true to say that medieval language about the natural jus enjoyed by a human being isn't something you can too rapidly translate into modern language about being entitled to happiness. But those who, like Ernest Fortin and John Milbank, have concluded that there's therefore an impossible gulf between medieval and modern doctrines of rights, miss the significance of what I earlier called the negative dimension of the argument. Appeal to a universal reciprocity, a proper exercise of freedom in concert with and for the good of others, is indeed very different from listing a set of individual entitlements without any reference to the common good or to the constructive balance of finite reality as a whole. But what it emphatically does is to define areas of life that human positive law cannot exhaustively direct or limit. There are things about human beings that cannot just be made or unmade by the enactment of a society. Aquinas' insistence on the natural lawfulness of the rich supporting the poor is directly linked by him to the argument that human law cannot overturn divine. And he turns this in a rather startling direction. A starving person who steals food is not guilty of theft in the strict sense, says Aquinas, because such a person is exercising their jus, their right, which is being overridden by other human agents. And it's that recognition of a potential tension between the positive law of a society and the natural order of a moral universe that fuels the original emergence of modern human rights discourse just as much as any shift towards a new and more atomized understanding of the individual. It's the ground for lawful resistance to or action to change certain sorts of political or social repression. If human law or human convention has the effect of frustrating a person's liberty to exercise powers that they rightfully should be able to exercise, including, in Aquinas' case, the power to stop yourself starving, that human law becomes unlawful, injustus. And it's this other strand in human rights discourse that seems to have been rather obscured in the critical attention directed towards individualistic, entitlement-focused rights. To concentrate on the failings of a rights culture in abstraction from the struggle for actual civic liberties and securities for all human beings within particular jurisdictions is a skewed perspective. And I find it very strange, for example, that a brilliantly articulate and humane scholar like Ernest Fortin doesn't, in his essays on the subject, discuss the civil rights movement in the United States, which is for many the paradigm of such a struggle. But, and here's the point at which contemporary critics of human rights discourse have to be taken seriously, the classical, theologically framed view in which my right, my jus, is a freedom to give what I'm meant to give, as well as to receive what I'm meant to receive, depends on a model of mutuality and of mutual responsibility for the flourishing of the other in particular, and the community in general. And it's perfectly right to ask what has happened to that element in a good deal of current language about this subject. Now, possibly this is because of a certain unease about what can appear to be the privileging of common good over individual welfare in a rather heavy-handed way. A medieval like Aquinas will deal with the grounds on which a political authority can inflict punishment and the extent of that punishment in a way that assumes, to a degree that most of us would find rather alarming, that public authority is free to infringe the right and dignity of the individual for the sake of the health of the whole social body. So, imprisonment, physical mutilation, and even death are legitimate forms of response to grave injuries to the social body. Despite the incipient sense in Aquinas of the primitive dignity of the human body as the irreducible base of human identity, and so of human presence to God, it seems that there are no a priori limits to what can be inflicted on that body by lawful authority to conserve the good of the social organism, the social body. So you don't necessarily go to Aquinas for enlightened views of penal policy. And any contemporary version of Aquinas' model of right would need to negotiate the problems here. It's very significant that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights includes a prohibition against degradingly cruel punishment. We've moved on. Ernest Fortin, in one of his essays on theology and human rights, has the blunt statement that dignity is, in pre-modern moral theology, something to be achieved or earned rather than assumed. But that treats dignity explicitly as a category whose recognition is dependent on conformity with the moral law. To be and to be good were two different things in the medieval context, says Fortin, and dignity is taken as a moral term implying worthiness to be treated in a certain way. And there is nothing intrinsically inviolable about the body in such a scheme. But it's hard to see exactly why this should be regarded as more consistent, let alone more theologically acceptable, than contemporary doctrines of rights. Granted that a lawful authority has the job of limiting the claims of any individual in the light of the common good, this doesn't in itself imply that there's no fundamental moral status for the human person simply as such. On the contrary, if the state or some other lawful agency limits the freedom of some group or individual, it'll presumably be on the grounds that the liberty they ask for is damaging to the liberty of other agents, and so is at odds with their jus, their right. And in the light of Aquinas' general view, allowing such a requested liberty would mean that the other or others, affected by such an unsocial freedom, would lose their capacity to give what in justice they are called upon to give, including what they should be giving to the initial claimant. In consequence, the original claimant loses the good he or she would receive from their frustrated neighbour. So everyone's basic moral position is affected if undue or disproportionate freedom is allowed to an individual. But so far from a prohibition of this amounting to a denial of inalienable right, it implies a very strong doctrine of what is mutually owed by human agents, simply as sharers in a good that is always and only constructed through reciprocal gift and nurture according to the capacity of each. This means that not only the morality of punishment as such needs discussion, but the morality of specific kinds of punishment. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in its strictures against cruel and degrading treatment, seems to be saying that some sorts of legal penalty are actually destructive of shared good. Limiting the liberty of an offender is a proper recognition of what is owed to real and potential victims. But at the same time, the logic of the argument suggests that some levels of limitation deprive the offender of too much, to the extent that they are no longer active sharers in any real social good. Put it in plainer English, is the prisoner still a member of society in any robust sense? If the answer is no, you've got some moral and political problems on your hands. Now, I don't think that's to claim that being and being good are the same in the sense that Fortin is presumably implying, though it's a curious phrase he uses. A glance at the first chapter of Genesis might prompt some second thoughts on this language. But it is to say that dignity, or whatever word we might want to use for the irreducible quality of the particular subject in a network of created agencies, is not, in fact, properly thought of as something that's earned or something conditional. Well, I'll want to come back later to the theological hinterland of this. But this is, I think, a point that needs clarifying by those who are critical of the modern insistence on inalienable rights. It's one thing to say that the notion of a non-negotiable individual right totally unconnected with an actively cooperative common good is a dangerous one, even an empty one. But I think it's something else to say that the ascription of value to a person occupying a unique place in the network of personal agency that is the finite world is somehow conditional on moral performance. And I'm just not clear if this is or is not meant to be the implication of the sort of point made by Fortin and Milbank. After all, it was the Christian philosopher Boethius in the 6th century, not John Locke, who defined the status of the person as sui juris et alteri incommunicabilis, existing in its own right, jus, and not communicable to another. To be a person is to be endowed with something that cannot be shared or diminished by external action, sui juris, in and of its own right. To be a person is to exercise the activity of being there as a real, unique participant in the convergent, reciprocal life of the finite world. And that's something that has about it the character of jus, right, lawfulness. Certain things are owed to it, over and above what it's thought to have achieved or deserved. It may be that, as has been argued, late medieval treatments of inalienable rights as a form of property do have the middle to long-term effect of allowing a determinedly ambitious state to appropriate to itself an inviolable power permanently transferred from the individual. An absolute jus, divorced from use and purpose, does indeed become a vacuous affair, all too readily alienated to an absolute executive power. But what Boethius means by an incommunicable status for the person is, of course, a reality that cannot be sold or annexed or transferred because it's intrinsic to the being of the subject in question. In that sense, to be and to be good are the same. There is a dignity belonging to the sheer being of the person. and understood in the context of the relations to God and the rest of creation, which constitute it what it is, this status is literally incapable of being lost. As the Catholic scholar Roger Ruston puts it, the relationships are not added on, as it were, after creation, but belong to what it means to be human, to have a human nature. What perpetually stands in the way of a state's ambition to be the controller of every aspect of its citizens' lives is this prior location of the individual agent within the context of a universal order, in which he or she is always constituted as one unrepeatable way in which God's self-giving in creation becomes actual. One unrepeatable way in which God's self-giving in creation becomes actual. That's what a person is. In brief, modern rights language may be indebted to some problematic strands in the late medieval and early modern intellectual tradition, but it still, knowingly or unknowingly, grows out of the basic conviction about the person represented by that tag from Boethius. Any rationale for resistance to an overambitious state, any challenge to the legitimacy of a systematically oppressive state, any program for the reform of an inequitable state, all depend on the belief that each particular embodied human agent occupies a place within the nexus of embodied agents that constitutes a unique point of creativity. Not in the debased sense of the word that associates it with disorganized self-expression, but in a stricter sense, for which the important thing is what the agent contributes to the building up of other agents. And in what's left of this lecture, I want to look briefly at some of the internal tensions in contemporary talk about certain alleged rights, and to ask what role a more directly theological consideration of the subject might have, and it might have to contribute to finding ways through, before I go on in tomorrow's lecture to develop what I hope is a slightly fuller theological account of the foundation of what I'd like to think is a defensible version of rights discourse, one that isn't just a religiously coloured version of a secular liberal consensus. I've been arguing that a fuller understanding of language about rights, in the light of some of these pre-modern discussions, is one in which we're not only urged to attend to the duties that rights entail, but also alerted to the recognition that a jus is about the ability to exercise certain powers, which in a religiously imagined universe involving acting so as to maximize another person's power to act morally and with spiritual integrity, with the effect of building up a fully mutual network of personal nurture. A just situation is one in which the particular person receives what is their due, but understands that part of what is their due is the ability to serve the good of the specific neighbour and the whole community. So to argue for a right that's unconnected with this constructive ability is eccentric, to say the least. So let's take, for example, the right to free speech, which is regularly and understandably treated as a test of liberal societies. That every citizen has the liberty to use their voice in public debate and discernment, and to explore imaginative possibilities in poetry or fiction or plastic art, is implied in any account of the issue that takes seriously a concept of jus as active power. But it doesn't follow that any individual has the moral liberty to say things that put in peril the well-being of particular neighbours. From the proverbial person shouting fire in a crowded space, to the use of inflammatory language against other individuals or groups. To ignore the challenges posed by any such unconstrained liberty is to misconceive the nature of the individual's jus. To allow such liberty would be to fail in respect for that right by indulging behaviour that would put them at odds with their rightful, lawful role as citizen. Problems arise when you present this simply as a clash of two isolated rights, I have a right to free speech, and you have a right not to be threatened or gratuitously offended. If we simply see that as a zero-sum game between contesting individual rights, we misunderstand the nature of rights language, as it's been elaborated in what I've said so far. And if you put it simply in those terms of the clash of two individual rights, the discussion easily becomes sterile or even violent, a standoff between supporters of two reified, abstract claims. Freedom of speech is not perhaps the most weighty issue where the approach to human rights I've outlined is pertinent. We've had a lot of debate in the United Kingdom in recent years around the possibility of legalizing physician-assisted dying. And frequent appeal has been made to a right to die, or at least a right to be spared intolerable and avoidable pain. That's sharpened, as you can imagine, the emotional register of this discussion quite a lot. Despite the intensity of the advocacy behind a change in the law on this subject, attempts to bring this about have not yet been successful, and their failure indicates, perhaps surprisingly, a continuing unease that has something to do with considerations of a wider common good. For example, campaigners representing people living with severe disabilities have argued that any attempt to spell out the sort of condition that might justify licensing a physician to cooperate with a patient in bringing about death could have the effect of implicitly defining, in public terms, some sorts of life as not worth living. This would be a failure to observe the fundamental principle of securing the jus, the right, of those actually living with disability to continue as active and respected citizens. Other arguments on this matter have appealed to the risk of decisions being made under pressure or in the light of economic considerations to do with the cost of continued treatment, and also to the general issue of trust between physicians and patients. In other words, despite the negative description of modern rights language by some theologians, public debate has not been uncritically dominated by a purely individualist account of rights. The basic liberty of any person to avoid suffering where possible is not being denied. Most opponents of assisted dying would agree that there is no moral imperative to regard prolonging life at all costs as a priority, and that a great deal more investment is needed in terminal care of the highest quality. But this particular expression of a liberty to avoid pain, in terms of assisted dying, is regarded by many as too damaging for the wider community and too threatening for various relationships, professional and familial, and for particular groups of citizens. I should say that seems to be still a majority position for now. I suspect the climate will change. There is, however, an unmistakable trend towards characterizing the preference for this one specific way of avoiding suffering as almost by definition the expression of a right, a lawful claim in itself. As with freedom of speech, problems arise when instead of a public calculation of what makes for overall justitia, there's a standoff between rigidly conceived claims, the right to avoid pain and the right, say, to respect as a person living with disability, or the right of a physician not to be expected to cooperate with a patient's desire to die. It's telling that the term dignity has been appropriated by advocates of assisted dying as designating their goal for the sufferer, with the implication that any other strategy of response to suffering denies such dignity. Dignity is equated with the capacity to bring about what one wills in these circumstances, and those who are critical of rights discourse will justifiably note that this slips a good way towards endorsing what's probably a very widespread belief that the individual is the authoritative definer of what constitutes the proper satisfaction of a claimed right. Now, to challenge this is not to say that some higher collective authority is licensed to override an individual's account of their desires or needs. It's simply to observe that what is jus, what is a right for someone, isn't a single, clearly demarcated and specific claim, but the entire ensemble of considerations that allow a person to act as a person whose good is realized in the context of positive mutuality. And that's where the critique of a property-like approach to rights is fair enough. A right to free speech, to a legal entitlement to oblige a physician to bring about my death, or for that matter, to bear arms, requires scrutiny in the light of what consequences may or do follow for the community as a whole, and more nebulously but still importantly, what messages are sent by a simple insistence on enlightenment. Which all, I think, helps us to understand why so many of our current debates can be so divisive and so sterile. Pro-life and pro-choice advocates in the abortion debate are both often fixated on individual rights when there are more complex issues to think about. A Christian critic of permissive abortion laws might point to the insoluble tangles about fetal rights in relation to a maternal right of choice, or to the messages that are given about the actual and ineradicable humanity of certain sorts of unmistakably human life, even when wholly dependent and incapable of survival outside the womb. It's a very interesting and brilliant recent book by James Mumford on some of this. At the same time, the serious feminist opponent of a legal ban on abortion will rightly ask, for example, what message is given by an ethic that apparently finds no moral problem in a woman being impregnated against her will. And the more we focus on what decisions will definitively satisfy individual rights, the more we fail to address the question of how decisions sit within a broader sense of jus and justitia. Not only what gives the individual what they have a license to claim, but what enables them and others to act in an appropriate relational manner. And for this dimension to be part of any intelligent political debate, there needs to be some attention paid within the debate to two things. First, we need a thicker experience of social collaboration. Individualist and absolutist rights language flourishes where there's a deficit in the actual experience of shared discernment about what is good for communities and of discovering fulfillment, even liberation, in such a context. If we're constantly driven back to the simple polarity of individual and state, client and supplier, we lose the capacity to understand ourselves as mutually responsible, involved, whether we like it or not, in the many-layered exchange by which we contribute to each other's humanity. Second, we need the audible presence in public debate of communities who have a fixed commitment to the non-negotiable value of every person. It's not enough to say that rational modernity provides a clear grounding for this sort of universalism, so that there's no necessity for any religious perspective to be introduced, the sort of case that Steven Pinker makes so eloquently and at such length. The experience of the last 2 centuries hardly justifies such a conclusion. The prevailing economic philosophy and practice of modern societies apparently takes it for granted that a very large number of human lives are effectively dispensable. There needs to be a constant pressure on liberal modernity to articulate and justify its rhetoric about equality. And this means that there needs to be a constant visibility within liberal modern societies of communities that offer a rationale for this rhetoric and a structure for attending to and realizing it. Such communities can't claim to dictate the terms of public decision-making. Again, in plain language, Christians do not always win arguments. But these communities are an indispensable tool for preventing liberal modernity from assuming its own self-evident character, and so failing to see its own dangerous fragility. In conclusion, then, in this first lecture, I've repeatedly been skirting the question of how exactly Christian theology substantively offers such ground for the political and social assumptions that push back against tyranny, discrimination, and violence. I've used the work of some theologians, medieval and modern, to illustrate the diverse lineage of our current ideas about rights. But my first aim this morning has been to do some ground clearing. Granted that rights discourse as it has been used in modern societies grates against many aspects of classical theological language, it is, I believe, a serious error to suppose that anything is gained by trying to dismantle any and every kind of rights-based public ethic. During the writing of this lecture, I took part in an event for the African Prisons Project in the UK, a charity which seeks both to advocate for more humane treatment of prisoners in various African states and to offer legal training for prisoners and prison staff in these contexts. It's one thing to be eloquently skeptical about the usefulness of rights language in the context of a prosperous culture in love with the fantasy of absolute individual security and protection against anything that might frustrate the projects of the solitary self. It is another thing to suggest that this language has nothing to say to a 30-year-old woman in South Sudan, shackled to the wall, in a jail where rape and other forms of physical abuse are routine, or to a man who has spent 15 years on death row in Kampala. We don't have to go to Africa for examples, as I need hardly say. But these are images which should properly bring us up short if we echo too glibly what is in danger of becoming a fashionable indifference to what rights discourse actually means in legal practice worldwide. But it's time to turn to the way in which theology specifically contributes to what I call the thickening of our understanding of justice by its doctrine of what constitutes us as human. In tomorrow's lecture, I want to fill this out by examining how a doctrine of the divine image grounds an ethic of recognition which is most fully rooted in our theology of the body of Christ. And then, by developing a perspective which I've sketched briefly elsewhere, on the human body as the key element in understanding the irreducibility or inalienability of rights. My hope is that these considerations may help to ground an approach to our political culture, which is neither a total campaigning dismissal of all elements of the liberal political settlement, nor a mere religious gloss on secular sentimentalities. But time will tell if this is a possible place to stand. Thank you.